rising inequality and rising austerity, when is the tipping point? So I'll give you the answer straight away, if you like. My answer is we've just passed it. It's already happened. We've hit a particular point and things are going to start getting better. A year before the London riots, I went down to London for 3 days and interviewed people. The leadership of the SWP, various other people, about were there any plans for riots, because I felt sure there were going to be riots. And if you remember then, there was nothing. Nothing happened that summer at all. There was nothing, and then a year later we get riots and things are bad. And the concern is whether we get them again. And much more than that. How many people lose their jobs, how many people have no future, no housing, no education, and so on. Tipping points. Different countries have different tipping points. There are different points at which things have got better and worse in the past. For me, the key tipping points for the United Kingdom are around about 1912. 1912 was the year of the kind of worst excesses of evil, in some senses, in my way of thinking. It's when Karl Pearson wrote his paper about eugenics, claiming that babies died because they were not fit to live. It's when the Titanic sank, and you got that passenger list showing you people's chances of dying, depending on where they were. And it was a year in which the richest 1% of the 1% got 400 times average income. The highest inequality we'd ever had recorded was 1912. Things tipped in 1912, and after 1912, the country became progressively more equal almost every year. You can look at the income stats on the top 0.01%, the top 0.1%, the top 1%, and you can see that most years equality grew from then onwards. The First World War was a big spur to it. The firstborn sons of the aristocracy were often killed. Many other people were killed, but inheritance reduced. 1920s and 1930s, over half of the increase in equality this country got between 1912 and the late 1970s occurred before the Second World War. And then it carried on with the Second World War, and it carried on in the 40s, 50s, 60s and 70s. 1912 was a tipping point. We can go back to that later if you want to. The second tipping point in the UK's history is 1979. Wherever you look, more and more inequalities in health, inequalities in wealth, a bit later, inequalities in income in that year, 1979, and the years just before it, from 1974 through to 79, was a tipping point. I don't think anybody quite realised in 1979, even in the early 1980s, that things had changed forever, but they had. So those are the two tipping points for the UK, from my point of view, 1912 and 1979. And I think we've passed another one. But I think it's the same as then. Back then, you'd have been a fool to say it. It wasn't sure. You can't tell. You're just teetering at the edge of something altering. Different countries all have different tipping points. The tipping point for the United States was the Second World War. There was no improvement in equality in the United States in the 1920s and 30s. It all happened in terms of income in the Second World War. So we're often told, because lots of our studies come to the US, that the Second World War was incredibly important. It was to the United States, it was not to Britain. Britain was already declining, and so the equality was already growing beforehand. Other countries have passed their tipping points a long time ago. Half of the OECD hasn't done what we in the United States have done. They haven't had this dramatic increase in inequality since 1979, 1980. The richest 1% in Switzerland and the Netherlands have never had a lower income than they have now. In France, they've kept the income of the rich relatively low, and they're about to tax them at 75%. You can go around the world and there are different trends, different tipping points, different stages. One thing that makes me think that something is happening now, and again this is looking at the income statistics in particular, is if you look just below the top 1%, and you look at what I want people to start thinking about as the 9%. So it's the rest of the 10%. It'll include quite a few people here. there's unlikely, looking at your clothes, unlikely to be any members of the 1% here, but if you're a well-paid general practitioner and your partner's a general practitioner and you sneaked in the room, you are a member of the 1%. But quite a few people here, particularly in my age and older, may well be in the 9%. The 9% followed the 1% as we became more equal, and their share of income fell for the 1920s, 30s, 40s and 50s. And then from 1979 onwards, the 1% get much, much more, get richer and richer and richer. But the 9% followed them, going from about 2.5 times average income to about 3 times average income. But in the last half dozen years, the 9% have seen their incomes reduced, their family incomes reduced. Often somebody's lost a part-time job in a house. Something else has occurred. So if you're trying to keep the current situation going, and you believe in inequality, you think it's okay to have these gaps in British society, you're losing that group, the economic support of the group just below the top 1%. I think when people talk about the squeezed middle, they're actually talking about the 9% very often, and not about people anywhere near the middle of the income distribution. There are many other reasons or things that hint to me that things are changing. Oswald Folks, who was a banker in the 1930s, said about Keynes that all Keynes had really done was to codify the moral feelings of an age in the 1930s. If you look at the 1920s and the 30s, and they're interesting from our point of view because that's the last time we had life expectancy gaps as bad as we are. The last time we had a recession as bad and as deep as this one. The last time we had a recession where more people were coming into the country than going out because the rest of the world was in recession. If you look back at the 1920s and 1930s, what you see, or what you can see, or at least what I see, is a change of attitudes from at the beginning of it, really nasty attitudes of complete superiority from the top. If you take William Beveridge, who was a particularly nasty eugenicist in his youth, was writing about how the upper classes had to have 4 babies for the survival of the race, and not the working class. He changed his attitudes throughout those 2 decades, along with other members of his social class, so that they could become architects of a welfare state and other things by the end. Trade unions mattered, communists mattered, revolutionaries mattered, suffragettes mattered, a lot of other things mattered. But if you look back at that last period when we became more equal, and the very start of that period when we became more equal, there was a changing attitude at the very top of society to what was acceptable, what was reasonable, and whether other human beings were like you or whether they were a lower species, something to be treated differently. Now, if you look at things like Bob Diamond going and the reaction to Bob Diamond going, from when he appeared to be absolutely solid to when he was gone and there was almost no lament to him disappearing, or if you look at things like Ferdinand Mount. Ferdinand Mount's, I think, very interesting. He's the cousin of David Cameron's mother. And he wrote a book called The New Few and declares in it how he's closed his account at Barclays and started a bank account at the Co-op. Now, when David Cameron's mother's cousin starts as a protest, I think he wants to sell more books, but does that, you're beginning to get something new. And a really interesting thing for me, or you may think I'm having my cake and eat it with this one, it's when people don't notice that this really is new, because the whole debate is moving towards a form of disgust with greed, where you're no longer impressed that somebody's made a lot of money and claims to be a wealth creator who will hence create lots of jobs, because that bubble's been pricked. When it all moves in that way, so that on the left people say, oh, no, you're still just as evil and nasty and selfish as before, then you're getting a real movement. This is a possibility. I'm just going to argue against myself briefly, at least to take away some of the easy arguments you could have against it. You could say, but look at the current government, look at the coalition, look at the fact they want to do an extra 10 billion of welfare cuts on top of the 80 already programmed, most of which haven't happened in the system. Look at the fact they're going to introduce an exam which is going to, well, people aren't even going to sit it again, like when I was a child and we did O-levels and CSEs. You could look at the British Social Attitude Survey that came out this week that showed that people are getting more hard-nosed and more callous and say people do not deserve welfare. That more hard-nosed and callous happened again as well in the 1920s, 30s. You could look across Europe. You could look at the rise of the Golden Dawn in Greece, how fascism is attractive again to many people. It's a route out. You could look at Mitt Romney, saying that half the people in the United States don't pay tax. These people don't deserve to live. Or, and I can see you look at all, you could look back at yourselves looking at them in shock, and then look at the middle of the intelligentsia in London, who are actually in the 1%, not in the 9%, but they feel they believe it because they only earn £150,000. And if you live in West London, where average house price is in Kensington and Chelsea, but it's now looking about 2 million for a flat, for a whole borough. If you watch the intelligentsia beginning to move in that direction, but still being annoying to you, which I guess, I'm trying to guess from your faces where you are, I think you can quietly have a little bit of hope. Now, what I'm not arguing is that the tipping point has definitely happened, it's definitely going to occur, but I think you can see some grounds for possible optimism. Clive James called this early. Clive James called this about 3 years ago in a wonderful radio piece where he said wealth has gone out of fashion, rather like the cod piece. Nobody struts around wearing a cod piece anymore. And the idea that you're good because you've become wealthy or your increased wealth is a sign of how much you've helped society, that idea. Now, I think he was early, but as you watch the new Director General of the BBC coming on less than the previous one, as you watch top bankers only taking an 11% pay increase last year, as opposed to a 40% one the year before, and as you're still disgusted that they're taking an 11% increase, do you see some of my optimism for things changing? I've only got 5 minutes left, and then I have to open it up. To give you more hope of optimism, go outside of Britain, look outside of this country. This is the 5th most unequal country of the rich world, of the 25 big rich countries in the world. Only 4 are more equal. This is a strange and unusual country. The most unequal is Singapore, and if you want to talk about a nightmare scenario for the future, we can talk about Singapore and the plan on the right to turn London at least into a kind of Singapore. The worst thing that occurs in Singapore, to my mind, is that the servants, we go back to having servants again if you like Singapore, 1 in 5 middle-class households have a maid. The maids used to be pregnancy tested every 6 months. I learnt last week they're now tested every 3 months to be deported if they're pregnant, which of course is what country houses used to do. Nicholas Soames MP last year suggested this for Britain. Okay? That's the most unequal country in the world, Singapore. The second most is the United States. It is becoming more equal, slightly, out of necessity. But that is currently occurring. Not necessarily planned by Obama, but occurring. It's increasing its public spending. Its public spending is going to be bigger than ours as a percentage of its GDP by 2015. The US and the UK are crossing over. Tea Party people come here to look for advice. The third is Portugal. And Portugal, under austerity, the rich are losing out, I think, more than the poor. The poor didn't have much to lose anyway. We're the fourth. The fifth is Israel. We are more socially divided and unequal in terms of income than is Israel. But if you look at the other 20 countries, you can see a different model of how you can be. They haven't all gone the same way. They've had small increases in inequality in some of the more equal countries, but absolutely tiny compared to us. If you go further out and look at the rest of the world, you can find lots of bad news stories, but you can sort of find some incredibly good news stories. Infant mortality in the last year worldwide appears to have had its biggest fall in human history. Nobody has celebrated this. The number of people dying under 5 in a year within the last 5 years has gone from 10 million down to 7 million. 5% fall in infant mortality last year. Fertility rates are currently plummeting worldwide as women choose not to have more than 2 babies or often to have 1 baby. World population is set to stabilise between 9 or 10 billion by the time I die. For the first time since the Black Death, we will have a reduction in the number of people and the value of labour is likely to rise. We have 100 million people graduating from universities at least a year, of which a narrow majority are female worldwide. Only 1% of university graduates worldwide can become rich, really rich. You can't have lots of rich people by definition. So we're going to have a world which is highly educated, and either they're going to sign up for this kind of levels of inequality increasing, or something else will occur. For the first time in world history, a majority of children are literate. The majority of their children should have access to the web the way things are currently going. But if you're inside this country, one of the world's most unequal countries in the rich world, and one currently choosing desperately to try to become more unequal, so that a few people at the top can hold on to what they've got, it can look very bad. I'll say one last thing about the tipping point in 1979, and then I'll shut up. So please do think of a question, because the worst thing is when you do one of these things and then it goes completely silent and nobody asks anything at all. That long period of things getting more equal, was it weird or what went wrong? My take on that is that what happened is we had incredible growth in the 1950s and 60s. If you look at the percentage GDP growth per year, it was very, very high, and it was unsustainable. You couldn't carry on growing at that rate. If you just take it forward, you'll see it was unsustainable to occur. There were various crises, oil shocks in 1973, and there were choices to be made around the rich world about how you dealt with this. The choice in Britain, I think, can be seen electorally in the elections in 1974. Very useful for people like me. There were 2 elections in 1974, and in the second of those elections, the southeast of the country swung to the Conservatives in large numbers. The country was becoming poorer, and a large number of people, not just the elite in London, but other people, decided they wanted to go for the party that would look after them. In 1975, the Conservative Party itself appointed its first woman leader and its first leader from a very different social background. By 1979, enough of the electorate had moved so that party came into power. And what they did is protect the self-interest of a group of people who were going to have to become poorer as the country as a whole became poorer from being the most powerful country in the world 40 years earlier. What's happening now is a desperate attempt from a few people at the top who have a lot of money to try to keep up their position. When bankers and FTSE chief executives argue for a 40% pay increase or 11% pay increase, they're actually not really arguing for that, because that's just in pounds. The pound's dropped by a quarter. They have property outside of this country. They can afford fewer skiing holidays. Their actual standard of living, as far as they're concerned, and security, is falling as well. I think you're seeing a desperate attempt to hold on to what people have the old times, an idea that this can all go back to normal, to 2005 again. Just keep the AAA rating. Just keep people paid well at the top. Keep the taxes low so that greedy French people come and live here rather than in France, and so on and so on. And as the experiment doesn't work, as the wealth creators don't create huge numbers of jobs that people want to do, as you find that when you charge young people £9,000 a year to go to university, 57,000 of them decide they don't want to go, and then shock horror, they don't want to go the next year because they're not going to get a job out of this. As the number of people in B&B rises, as the number of middle-class people who feel insecure about their jobs increases, as you begin to lose control on the mortgage interest rate, which you cannot keep at these low rates forever, if you've got to defend sterling, as things begin to get worse in the way they're already getting worse, and as the majority of the cuts still have to occur, either the 99% of people who are now losing out are utterly stupid, or they won't go along with it any further. That's why I say I think the tipping point has already happened. It's happened economically. But if you go back to, say, 1912, you didn't have a sudden political revolution. You didn't have a new party that immediately got into power. The Labour Party only properly got into power in 1945. But long before they got into power, things were already beginning to improve and to change. I can see signs out there that there is now a kind of disgust with greed rather than an envy of the rich, that it is increasing, that there's a realisation that there really isn't enough to go around and you can't allow a few people to keep on taking so much. I don't think things will improve unless people are angry and carry on being angry, but I do think that if you feel it's hopeless and just a small number of people are going to carry on doing well and most people will do badly, and if you can't get yourself into that small group, you might as well emigrate, but where do you go? I think that kind of attitude will not get towards what it might be possible to get towards. And the aberration may have been 1979 to 2008 and not 1912 to 1979. That's half an hour. Thank you very much for listening to me.